Hello, it's another episode of The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian. The upstanding rector is the Reverend David J. Lucy, rector of St. Francis Episcopal Church in Great Falls, Virginia. And I'm Kathy Wallman, the Curious Christian, also coming to you from Great Falls, Virginia. Today, we're going to talk about something that's been on my mind, and that is the topic of why must we pray? If God is omniscient and omnipotent, doesn't he already know what we want? And doesn't he have the power to grant it? It's been on my mind, and I thought no one better to illuminate this subject than the upstanding rector, Reverend Lucy.
Kathy? Oh, you want me to answer the question? So the reality is, yes, God knows what we are thinking and knows what we're feeling deeply and intimately. But prayer is a form of conversation and connection with God, and that's an important part of the process of both communicating to God what we need, what we want, and God receiving. Could God do it without our involvement? Yes, but I think the Bible is pretty clear that God wants our agency involved in lots of things, healing the world, serving our neighbors, and even in prayer. So yes, it's personal, it's internal, and Todd still uses that. I also think unformed, i.e. unspoken, prayer is often confused and muddled. And I think the process of praying also helps clarify our thoughts to ourselves, in addition to clarifying our thoughts to God. So yeah, God could know, but that's not how he's chosen for us to work together.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know.
So I do think that sometimes when I am praying for something that I think I know I want, it gets revised. That's not, I'm not asking, for example, for God to take away some form of suffering or challenge. I find that I'm praying instead for guidance about how to meet it, and for the strength to meet it, and the grace to accept those parts that I can't affect.
Right.
I start out praying, please take this away, and I end up praying, just help me meet the challenge, help me be my best version of myself to do what I can about this.
So what you're describing is sort of laudatory and a pretty mature approach. So there's nothing wrong with just asking for what you want or need outright. But I do think the process of praying takes us to a place where we're asking God to essentially tell us what to ask for. And it often plays out in our minds as a serial thing, though. If God lives in the eternal present, it's immediate to God. It's not, maybe not to us. One of the things I will do right here is use a book that actually got me started on my prayer life years ago. And it's a book called Celebration of Discipline. It's by Richard J. Foster. It's been around for 35 or 40 years now. And it's the path to spiritual growth. And what's interesting about this book, let me just give you a bit of a background. Richard Foster ends up pursuing what one would often refer to as the Catholic, and I mean that in the small c and large c traditions of prayer and spiritual discipline, so that we shape it. Though he's not a Catholic himself, he comes from a Mennonite tradition, which makes this really interesting. And the book is not very long or big. Let me just hold it up and show you. It's not. It's broken down into chapters that are very digestible, and it's broken into 3 parts about the disciplines. So part 1 is the inward disciplines, part 2 is the outward disciplines, and part 3 are the corporate disciplines. For the inward disciplines, we have meditation, prayer, fasting, and study. For the outward disciplines, we have simplicity, solitude, submission, and service. And for the corporate disciplines, we have confession, worship, guidance, and celebration. So the fact that we have these inward, very personal forms of discipline, and then we move all the way into corporate disciplines because we are not individual Christians all by ourselves. We are in community. And that's a really important part of the process. And there are corporate prayers, and I know we're probably going to talk about that. Let me read to you a few things from Richard Foster, and I hold these things dear because I still follow them. And whenever I really feel like my prayer life is sagging, I actually go to Richard Foster to re-energize them. So he begins his chapter, The Discipline of Prayer, with this quote from Juliana, Dame Juliana of Norwich, who was a noted mystic. As I've told you before, this is the way I like my mystics, in small chunks. I have a hard time reading them all the way through. And I love it when people excerpt their wisdom for me, just as Richard Foster has done. And this is what it says. I am the ground of thy beseeching. First, it is my will, thou shalt have it. After, I make thee to will it. And after I make thee to beseech it, and thou beseechest it. How should it then be that thou shouldest not have thy beseeching? So that's from Dame Julian of Norwich. She was a big believer in prayer. And this is what the introduction to Foster's chapter on prayer says. Prayer catapults us onto the frontier of the spiritual life. Of all the spiritual disciplines, prayer is the most central because it ushers us into perpetual communion with the Father. Meditation introduces us the inner life. Fasting is an accompanying means. Study transforms our mind. But it is the discipline of prayer that brings us into the deepest and highest work of the human spirit. Real prayer is life-creating and life-changing. Prayer, secret, fervent, believing prayer, lies at the root of all personal godliness, writes William Carey, who was an Archbishop of Canterbury. To pray is to change. Prayer is the central avenue God uses to transform us. So, when I think about praying and I think about our life, and it's sort of very interesting. Being in the presence of God is a lot about change. Something that we really, and I think one of the reasons people have a hard time in their prayer life is an unwillingness to experience change. And, change, whatever else, is a constant. Now, I know one of my great definitions of God is love, and that's true. But I may have to expand that to say, well, I may not. God is about change. That's the constant of God. The world is changing all around us. And if God is love, then love is change as well, and transformation of our hearts. So, your questions about this are real. And I think what's going on in the process of prayer, as you're describing it, is a shaping of us and an openness to God's being, even as we speak the words and let them flow out of us. There's an interaction going on. Now, I will tell anybody at times we need to stop saying and start listening. But I even think in the process of forming and shaping our prayer, we're in the process of learning and changing ourselves in relationship to God
Mhm.
and in relationship to the world around us. So, I think that's a really important part and aspect of what you're talking about.
Mhm. I wanted to talk just briefly about a prayer experience, maybe two prayer experiences, but one prayer experience that I remember from being very young, about 10 years old. And the news had come in the night before that Robert F. Kennedy had been shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And we lived in Massachusetts. We celebrated the Kennedys in many different ways. And it was a roiling shock to get that news. So I came home from school the day after he was shot. He was still alive. And I got down on my knees in my bedroom with the door closed. And we usually prayed as a family. So this was different for me to go off by myself and pray. And I remember praying to God, I don't think I've ever really asked you for something, but I'm asking now that you spare the life of Robert F. Kennedy. And, I'll do anything if his life can be spared. And so I introduced perhaps an element of bargaining in there that I suppose a lot of people do. I'm not too proud of that, but it was a really earnest request on my part that his life be spared, um, and it was not granted. And to my 10-year-old self, it was like, what gives? That was an earnest request. I'm not asking for a puppy, a bicycle, or a pony. I'm asking, on behalf of a wounded person to save his life. And I found that hard to integrate into my prayer life. On the other hand, there have been times when I prayed, maybe 3 times in my life, times when I prayed, and in those circumstances, I didn't even realize I was praying. My mind was just open to possibilities. And in those 3 instances, I had an answer. And I don't know where it came from. It didn't come from inside me, but something, Holy Spirit delivered in each case a reassuring answer or asked me a question that cemented a reassurance. So, when I try to integrate these experiences, I know that prayer and response to prayer is true. But sometimes it's hard for me to make sense of what God decides to grant and what he doesn't. And then I'll throw in this final thing, this question: is any subject too trivial to pray about? When I did my pre-Cana, when I was getting married, um, people referred to praying for the return of a stolen bicycle. And my fiance, now husband, and I talked about that, like, what right do we have to impose on God's consciousness the idea that somebody's missing a bicycle and would like to have it back, please? So I'll stop there and just ask for your impressions on that.
So communication with God is a really tricky place. I mean, I think there were some extravagant promises given over in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus encouraged us to pray. He said, assume a man has a neighbor who comes to him for bread at the middle of the night. He says, I have a guest. You give me some bread so that I can feed my guest. And he said, well, that man may not give it to him because he actually, thinks likes him, but he'll give it to him because he's annoyed that he keeps asking. He said, certainly God is better than that. And so there is that aspect. And yet, when we look at our lives and we look at all those prayers, we don't see what the consistency is in the granting of them. I'd like to say it would be, let me give you a reassurance. I think it's complicated to know the mind of God. By the way, in the end, in your fervent prayer for Robert Kennedy, given what happened to him, it may have been better for Robert Kennedy that he did not have to recover from it. So, there's more than one party involved in prayer when we're praying out there. And I think that's important to remember. So, yes, pray for it. We've been encouraged by Jesus to do it. Secondly, if we're fervent in prayer, things may happen to us that we aren't expecting, because the change that happens most in prayer is not to other people for whom we're praying, and yet that can happen. It's to us. That deep acknowledgement that, here's somebody I think is really important to the world and I care for, and I'm going to pray for this person. Robert Kennedy, excuse me. And yet there are forces in some ways beyond our control. There is prayer ultimately that, first of all, there was great courage in doing that, even though there was also probably some great hunger for the reassurance that a good man could be saved by God even on his deathbed. And those are things that I think require us not to stop prayer in those places, but to begin to pray more for understanding, for comprehension, for the change in our lives that will affect the world in ways that will help people know the love of God. So I wish I could tell you I have an easy answer. I don't. I will tell you it's okay to ask for the return of the stolen bicycle. I do not believe there are things too trivial for God to answer. I sometimes chuckle when I see athletes praying in the end zone and nuns showing up praying for the Chicago Cubs. For me, I'm sort of like, I can't do that prayer, but they certainly believe in it, and I hope it helps them. I don't know whose side God takes in any of these things. I do. It's really interesting because he was not necessarily a traditional Christian, although I think in the end he did die in some sense of Christianity. It was Abraham Lincoln, and when he talked about the war between the states, the Civil War, he said, we got people, I'm paraphrasing very 21st century style, we got people praying on both sides of this. I happen to think the prayers coming from Abraham Lincoln were actually probably more valuable than some of the prayers coming from his Southern counterparts. But yeah, I mean, if we believe in this, we can. There's prayers going up all the time, and so here's what I would say: keep praying. We're not always going to get the outcomes we want, but we may end up with the change we need. And so that's the best I can tell you. We can pray for others, help for others, but the change that's going to happen is going to happen in the person who's the petitioner prayer, I think.
But how do we know he's listening?
Well, I'll give you a really quick answer, and it's not always the great one. There was a wonderful Archbishop of Canterbury named William Temple. In the 1940s, he is well known for having said, "When I pray, coincidences happen, and when I don't, they don't." So, the best I can compare is I'm a married man. I've been married to my wife, Catherine, for 36 years now. and we have an ongoing relationship and speaking. And I will confess to the sin of not always listening as deeply as I should or communicating verbally as well as I should. I've found that when Catherine says something important and I listen, it does change me. I find when I speak clearly, she responds. But I have to look for the signs and the signals of that comprehension and that reality. And I think the same thing is true for us. Sometimes we throw prayers up there. I was in a period of my priesthood where I was exhausted and overly stretched. And I can remember looking at my wife and saying, look, I'm just going to go pray the daily office today. I'm not expecting any answers. I'm just kind of throwing the gifts, I'm throwing the things up to God and letting him take care of it, because I don't have enough energy to look for the signs that he's doing a thing. And so in the thing I will say there is, number one, yes, please keep speaking if that's where you are right now. The other thing is sometimes it requires us to start paying attention to begin to understand, oh, he really did answer my prayer and I didn't do it. You know, part of the issue with God is God's presence is so overwhelming. This is the creator of the universe. God would completely engulf us if we allow for it, and especially if we allow for it and are unprepared for it. I think God values our individuality, but he wishes us to be one as he and his son were one. But that didn't mean that there wasn't a person, Jesus, who bore the Christ, the second person of the Trinity. That meant that both things were true at the same time. And we would call that a paradox, but in God's environment, it's not. So, you know, learning how to be part of that communion, as Richard Foster talked about, perpetual communion, eternal communion with God. It takes effort to begin to learn to deal with those things.
So I was intrigued to learn. I think most of my prayers tend to be either thanksgivings or petitions. But I noted that in the Catechism, found in the Book of Common Prayer, beginning at page 856, there's a section on prayer and worship, and it identifies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different kinds of petitions, 5 in addition of prayer, 5 in addition to the 2 I mentioned, thanksgiving and petition. The principal kinds of prayer are adoration, praise, thanksgiving, penitence, oblation, intercession, and petition. Penitence, oblation, intercession, and petition. And then it goes through each of those categories and gives a brief answer about what each of those means. Do you have any comment on that? Is it useful to classify prayers?
I think it's useful to classify prayers for this reason alone, is to remember aspects of our relationship with God that we may forget. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you're most often looking to pray in a sense of intercession, which is great. And it's probably, you know, if I were doing a survey for Family Feud, I would probably say, and which kind of prayer is the most common? And that would be the one. But 86% of us, yeah. So I think that's true. But I think probably number 2 is penitence of some sort. Mm-hmm. But I do think that praise and thanksgiving are really important things to do, to acknowledge, you know, who God is, and to make us grateful in our hearts. I think sometimes when we're focusing primarily on penitence and thanksgiving, we get into that transactional relationship we may have been talking about earlier, and it sort of stunts our growth in other areas. So I think that's really important, and I think intercession's probably up there in the top 3, maybe even more than penitence. But I'm guessing with the Catholic Church and confession. Penitence is a big one. So, but intercession is also a big one, and so in the end, I think to forget those aspects of God that are worthy, praise, thanksgiving, and adoration, I think we lose something. So, it's really interesting. I love the fact that in the Roman Catholic Church and some high Episcopal churches, you have the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, which is the real presence of Christ. Now, I will tell you that hasn't been one of my spiritual disciplines in my life, but I think it's really cool that people just go adore the real presence of Christ. And sometimes we just forget to adore God. And so to the extent that this covers a breadth of ways to communicate, and that we sometimes forget aspects of communication that are really important, yeah, I think it's good. Other ways to categorize? No, I mean, I just, I think in the basic fact, just continuing a prayer life, I think a lot of it has to do with, as we talked about, as we form the words, the Holy Spirit helps us form them, and then we know how to pray, as Paul would have said. The Spirit helps us in our prayers. So yeah, I think just getting down and praying is the important part. Necessarily going through that list, adoration, praise, thanksgiving, etc., is not great. Although I will tell you, using those outlines, when you look at the prayers of the people of an Episcopal, church service for the Eucharist, and what's sort of put into the basics that we have to cover every week, you're getting adoration, thanksgiving, all those things are covered in those prayers, which I find really helpful as well.
So adoration was always kind of a stumbling block for me. And there's a church that I have attended from time to time, St. Thomas of Becket in Reston. They actually have a chapel devoted to adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. And it's in my recent experience, it's a locked facility. You have to sign up in order to go in and participate in the adoration. But just adoration as a concept has been troubling to me, because God, because he's omniscient and because of who he is, he already knows how great he is. What am I adding by adoring him? But I thought this answer from the Catechism was interesting. It says, what is adoration? Adoration is the lifting up of the heart and mind to God, asking nothing but to enjoy God's presence. And we've touched in various places in the course of these episodes on the idea of a thin place, a place where the physical meets the spiritual and doors are open to experiences, potentially life-changing experiences. And so as I read this, it's a helpful way of thinking about how to bring yourself into a thin place and bring yourself into the place where the door swings open and things can happen. And so I've benefited from looking at this list of definitions and answers as to what the purpose of adoration might be. Now, maybe I've tainted my own prayer by recasting it as, what's in it for me. But I do think that I now see a role for prayer and adoration that I didn't appreciate before.
So that's a really profound insight. And let me also say, quite often prayer, it's not about God, it's about us. And so I think part of adoration is to remind us God's worthy of adoration. I mean, that's more of a reminder for me than it is, if I think of God mostly as a dispenser of gifts for me alone, but not just by God's very existence being of value, it can trend toward again transactional, and I think that's a real pitfall for all of us, is just thinking that God's there. I'll bargain with God. You said it earlier with, that hesitation that, it's like bargaining with God. I don't really think God's all that transactional, and yet we do it.
Mhm.
Dear God, if you do this for me, I will do these other things for you. Uh,
Right.
yeah. I have a little story. I had a friend who was a priest, and he was in his discernment, and he was in seminary, and he was his bishop um, went to visit him while he was in seminary, and asked him. He said, "Well, have you reflected on the call to holy orders?" And my friend said, Um, "Oh yeah, I've been thinking about it." He says, "Have you been praying about it?" And he goes, "Yeah, sure, I have." And the bishop, showed some great insight. He says, "Well, could you tell me exactly what shape your prayer is taking?" At which point, the seminarian said, "Well, it sounds something like this: Oh God, please don't let me be ordained." He goes, "Well, that's sincere." So he's been a priest for over 40 years now, but it was interesting. He was
Mhm.
clearly a little hesitant to proceed, but
Mhm.
you know I think about that because the rejoinder to that was he was then interviewing a week later for possible placements as a curate or a priest in a parish. So he had signed up,
Mhm.
and he said, and I walked into the interview, and remember now he's an Episcopal, he's training to be an Episcopal priest, and he said the man who met me looked like one of the ZZ Tops participants, wearing a leather jacket, having a beard to his waist, and long hair and sunglasses on. He said, and in the end, that was his first cure. They
Mm.
asked him to come be part. So, he said, oh, so, our encounter with prayer is always interesting.
Mhm. So the final subject that I wanted to raise today is um, about the difference between, or maybe the unity between personal prayer and
Right,
corporate congregational prayer.
right.
Why is each important, and how do we how do we think about the role of both in our lives?
Well, the the personal prayer I think is probably the easiest to answer. It's our direct communication with God as individuals. But the corporate prayer is that the Christian life is really not an individual experience alone. It is a corporate bodily experience, and participating in the prayers of the corporate body is a really important part. What does the corporate body need? And by the way, not even our incorporation into the body in our local congregations is not in and of itself sufficient. One of the really impressive ideas that I got, this would be about evening and morning and evening prayer, but it's also a Eucharistic thing that as you go across the globe and people meet, the times that they regularly meet, that God is constantly having prayers lifted up before him
Mhm.
as incense before the morning sacrifice. It's part of the prayer book, and you begin to understand. Oh my gosh, we're connected to all of this,
Mhm.
and it empowers us, and also makes our prayer more powerful. And so that's the corporate part of it. It enhances us, but we also enhance it. So one of the things that I try to remind myself continually is that you know um, communication is a constant engagement back and forth, and we sometimes, because God most often doesn't speak into our brain, though that happens, um, that we feel like we're just putting it out there, and to be assured within the community is a really important part. And that's why private and corporate prayer go together.
Well, we've reached our 30-minute self-imposed time limit. So I want to thank you very much for all these insights. You've been very helpful to me, and I hope it will be helpful and useful to everyone who sees this. We're signing off episode 10 of.
Thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I will see you next time because it's on Zoom.
It's very good. Thank you. Bye-bye.